The 24-25 NFL season is done. It's officially in the history books, and we're moving on as the Eagles hoist up the Lombardi. But before we start ramping up towards the next season, especially as we get towards March and April, let's do a point of reflection. Today, I'm going to give you my honest grade and evaluation on how all 32 teams performed. And it seems fitting to start off with the Eagles and the teams of the NFC East, considering that they just won the Super Bowl. And let's cut right to the chase. This season went about as perfect as you possibly could have asked for if you're a Philadelphia Eagles fan. After a really tough end to the previous season, they clearly had a couple of main holes that needed to be addressed. They needed to get better with their offense, with their running back situation. They go out and get Saquon. They draft 2 stud defensive backs to upgrade their secondary. They're able to upgrade their linebacking core overnight with the signing of Zach Bond. And look what happened. They go from this team that looks like a pretender to winning 14 games and cruising their way to the Super Bowl, blowing out the Chiefs in the process. You can't ask for a better season. It went about as perfect as humanly possible. So it goes without saying, and it pains me to say this as a Giants fan, but it is an A+ season for the Eagles. Really good stuff from them. Next up, the Washington Commanders. And while the season ended in a pretty sad way, you got one game away from the Super Bowl, you came up short. We can't just sit here and not acknowledge what Washington accomplished this year. They defied all possible expectations they had coming into the year. They crushed it out of the park, winning 12 games on the season and making it to the NFC Championship game when this was supposed to be year one of their rebuild/retooling session as they try and figure out what they have with their new franchise quarterback, Jaden Daniels. And this kid completely transformed this football team. They have a stud at quarterback. That alone is enough for this to be an unbelievably successful year, but they went so far above and beyond with how competitive they were, with how many games they won, the fact that they were able to upset some good teams in the playoffs along the way. The Commanders have jump-started their rebuild, and they have so much cap space coming up into this offseason, and there's a lot of room for them to only get better from here. Think about it like this. This was Jaden Daniels' first year as a pro player. Realistically, this was the worst version of him that we might ever see. This is such a great place for Commanders fans. They have solidified themselves as one of the NFC juggernauts, and there's a chance that things could get a lot more scary moving forward. Definitely have to go with an A grade, considering the expectations that they had and what they accomplished, and just how bright the future looks. The Dallas Cowboys. I mean, let's be real. It's always Super Bowl or bust at this point with the boys, and this season was an absolute dumpster fire for them. They weren't playing that great at the beginning of the year. There were a lot of clear-cut struggles. The offense didn't look that great. Defense wasn't performing up to par. They had injuries across the board, and then it only got worse when Dak got injured. Now, I acknowledge that they were still able to get some quality wins with Cooper Rush in there. They didn't have the worst record in the world, but Dallas, they're supposed to be competing for a Super Bowl. Any year where they don't at least make the NFC Championship, just knowing how things have gone recently is a major disappointment. This season absolutely went up in flames, and I'm giving them a D+. And last and most certainly least in the East, we've got the Giants, the bum-ass Giants. In their 100 years of existence, this was their worst by far. What a way to celebrate your 100 years, man. You go out there and win 3 games, your franchise player leaves you, goes to the Eagles, a division rival, wins the Super Bowl while trash-talking you along the way, amongst so many other players leaving you and having great seasons as well. Every feasible way that this could have been a bad year ended up coming into fruition. The Giants need a quarterback now. They don't have a lot of talent. They're the clear-cut worst team in their division, and there's no clear-cut end in sight. This was a terrible year for this franchise, and I'm absolutely embarrassed that I'm supporting them right now. They get an F. I'd give them an F- if I could. Honestly, at this point, I should give them a G. We should go beyond F, lower than that even, because this season was awful, and the fans deserve way better. Looking into the NFC North, let's start off with the Lions. I want to say that this was a disappointing season because at this point it was Super Bowl or bust. After coming so close last year, that was logically the last step that they needed to take, and it really sucks that they didn't get there. You have to tack off some points for that. but at the same time, they were a very exciting football team this year. They won 15 freaking games, and I want to give them at least some kind of benefit of the doubt, considering the plethora of injuries on this team. I mean, you can make an all-pro team with all the injuries this team suffered. It was a disaster, and you could argue if they were fully healthy, this year could have been vastly different, because we saw what their defense could do when healthy, but at the end of the day, you can only grade them so high just knowing the expectations on the year. It was a really sad way to go out, choking to the Commanders, not even making the conference championship game, so I feel like I can only give them a B. It was definitely an above average season, but more was expected of them. Speaking of expectations, how about the Minnesota Vikings? Clearly, they still have a ways to go, considering they still can't win any playoff games, despite some impressive seasons in recent memory. We still got to give them a lot of credit, man. Coming into this year, expectations weren't all that high. They moved on from Kirk Cousins, they wanted to see what they had in J.J. McCarthy and or Sam Darnold, but then McCarthy went down with a season-ending injury before they could even see what he could be as a potential franchise quarterback in the regular season, so they went out there with Sam Darnold, and the expectation was this team wouldn't be that good. But instead what we got was a team that won 14 games and made the playoffs with Sam freaking Darnold at quarterback and a lot of studs emerging on defense. I just feel like, considering how much this team wasn't expected to do anything, that you kind of have to grade them high. It's a testament to what they could be if they do have the right guy under center, someone that isn't Sam Darnold, if J.J. McCarthy can be the real deal. A lot of credit has to go to that coaching staff that they can win 14 games with Sam Darnold, who was terrible before coming here. Vikings really did have a great year. I'm giving them an A-, even though they still have a long way to go. Next up, you got the Green Bay mother-loving Packers, and, there was supposed to be some kind of improvement with them. They didn't have a bad season, but clearly they were not what they were hoping to be. They damn near made the NFC Championship last year, so it felt like the only logical place was to go up from there, with the talent they had, with the additions they made in the offseason, but they just could not take the leap. If anything, they kind of went backwards. Yes, they made the playoffs, but they weren't able to beat any really good opponents at the end of the day. They had a completely winless record against teams with a better record than them on the year. Winless against the Vikings and the Lions, couldn't beat the Eagles 2 times as well. It just felt like there was so much left on the table for the Packers. They were very stagnant. Obviously, they still have a good foundation. Maybe things could be better next year, but this felt like an average year with no improvement, so I'm giving them a C. And lastly, there's the Chicago Bears, and needless to say, there was a lot of hype coming into this season, and honestly, with how it started, it felt kind of justified. The Bears got off to a decent start, they were looking competitive, seemed like maybe they had an outside shot looking in at making the playoffs, alongside their franchise quarterback and all these exciting offensive pieces, but then things kind of blew up in their faces. I mean, from the Commanders game and onward, this team was completely unrecognizable. A lot of offensive struggles throughout the season. Caleb had no time to throw. That O-line was absolutely terrible. The coaching was a disaster. I mean, they fired Eberflus mid-season. Everything that could have went wrong for the Bears in such an exciting time basically did. And that really sucks, because there was supposed to be a lot of points of optimism, and they just weren't there. Maybe with a better coach in place and with an upgraded O-line, things could be different. But right now, you're definitely craving a lot more than what was advertised if you're a Bears fan. I'm going with a D for their grade, simply because that losing streak that they went on was unacceptable. Now for the NFC South, starting with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And getting straight to the point, it's pretty impressive that they were able to win their division for a second season in a row, especially when they faced a lot of adversity, plus some injuries early on in the year. They went on that losing streak, things weren't looking good, but they buckled in while dodging the explosions to maintain their supremacy over this division, and they damn near were able to win a first-round playoff game again. Baker Mayfield had another solid year. It felt like the Bucs did what they needed to, but there were a lot of struggles along the way. There were some turnover issues with Baker for sure, and they didn't show any progression. It's the same thing with the Packers. I give them a lot of credit for facing that adversity. That gives them some points for sure, but all you can really do is give them a B-, because if anything, they actually got worse compared to last year, seeing as they didn't win any playoff games at all this time. Next up is the Atlanta Falcons, and man, was I wrong about these guys. I was expecting them to win the division for sure this time. They addressed the one thing they needed in the offseason. They picked up Kirk Cousins, who isn't a great quarterback, but is better than what they had. So the expectation was the offense would be amazing and they'd be able to make it through maybe with like 10 wins, but they weren't even able to do that. Because after the first handful of games, Kirk Cousins looked absolutely horrible, and it got to the point where in his first year of being on this team, where they overpaid for him massively, they switched over to their rookie quarterback that they drafted. This was just such a weird year. The Falcons had higher expectations. It felt like the same team as last year, even though this was supposed to be the year where they took the leap, where they had the talent to be competitive offensively, but it just wasn't there. The Kirk Cousins signing blew up in their faces, and they're already looking to move on from the guy. The only bright side was we saw some impressive flashes from like Bijan and Drake London and whatnot, but that's about all they had going for them. They were supposed to win the division, and they didn't. Disappointing year overall. I'm going with a D grade. How about the New Orleans Saints? Well, it was a pretty disastrous year, huh? Remember the first 2 games when we thought that they were turning the corner and they'd be one of the dark horses of the year? That was fun while it lasted, huh? Derek Carr didn't look so great after that. He was dealing with injuries. The whole team felt like they're injury riddled, and they just couldn't compete because of that. The whole Derek Carr injury completely took them out of contention from a very early point in the season. And obviously, Derek Carr isn't the answer either. So they have a lot of questions about their QB situation and how to address it. Not to mention the horrible cap situation they're in as well. The Saints, they are in one of the worst spots in all of the NFL. And this season should be the turning point and the signal that things desperately need to change. This was a horrible year. I want to give them some kind of leeway because of the Derek Carr injury, but I just can't because we knew this was going to happen. I'm giving them a D-. And of course, we end things with the Carolina Panthers. And at the start of the year, it seemed like this would be an F grade. There was no progress, the team had no talent, no direction, Bryce Young still looked horrible, they benched him for Andy Dalton, but then because of a car crash, we were able to see Bryce Young go back in there, and suddenly, he looked like a completely different player. It's almost like getting benched for Andy Dalton was some kind of reality check. Like, it gave him some kind of push. It gave him that chip on his shoulder that he needed, because then Bryce started playing like the number 1 overall pick that he was supposed to look like. After about the halfway mark, him and the Panthers became a way more fun team to watch. They won a bunch of games in the process while playing spoiler from time to time as well. The Panthers seem like they're starting to turn the corner out of nowhere because of Bryce Young suddenly becoming a special quarterback, realizing his potential. This is only the beginning too. The Panthers, if they can build the rest of the team around him and he can improve even more, then we're going to be looking at a team that could maybe compete for the division title in a couple of years. Obviously, still a long way to go, and it was a rough start to the year, but with how it ended, it's got Panthers fans feeling pretty good, and I can't blame them for that, so I'm going to give them a C. And lastly is the NFC West. Starting with the Rams, I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed. This team had to overcome a lot of adversity. It was a rough start to the year. It seemed like they had no chance in hell of making the playoffs, but they got hot in the second half of the year. They looked competitive. They reawoke themselves after recovering from the injuries on offense. The defense also showed some great improvements, and the Rams were able to not only make the playoffs, but win a playoff game this time, which means improvement compared to where they were last year as a surprise team. This was a feel-good story. I mean, they were really close to making it to the NFC Championship game in very unlikely fashion. Now, there's a lot of questions about their future with Cooper Kupp and Matt Stafford in particular, but at least you can look back at this season and say that it was a lot of fun. Final grade, B. But how about the Seattle Seahawks? Well, I'd say that this season went a bit better than some people thought it would. I myself was really low on this team. I had questions about the O-line and Geno being another year older, but they proved all the haters wrong. They won 10 games, and if it weren't for a random tiebreaker, they could have had an opportunity to win the division in Week 18 against the LA Rams. And then maybe you look back at the Giants game and say they probably shouldn't have lost that, but that's hindsight at the end of the day. This Seahawks team overperformed in terms of my expectations, and I loved watching them. They were really fun. Geno Smith had a great year, and they got some tremendous production out of JSN. It was a great sophomore season for him, and he's looking like a great replacement for Tyler Lockett. Now, the question is going to be if they can take the next step going into the next year. I just don't know, considering that Geno's career is kind of on a ticking time bomb, so to speak, at this point. But bare minimum, you have something there. This year was pretty enjoyable, so I'll give them a C+. It was sad to see them come up short, and there's some games they definitely choked away, but nonetheless, I'd say about an average or slightly above average season. The Arizona Cardinals. Speaking of above average, these guys balled out at certain points throughout the year. For a while, it seemed like they were going to win this division with Kyler Murray and how exciting the offense looked. There were some games where they were blowing some people out and being super competitive against some very relevant playoff teams. The problem is they aren't the best coach, they don't have the greatest consistency, and there's a lot of questions about Kyler Murray and his ability to perform. He didn't do the greatest at giving the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr. all the time. On the bright side, you got some good production out of Trey McBride, but it just felt like this team was a little all over the place. They end up surrendering their division lead. They choke in epic fashion. They collapse. They don't make the playoffs. They don't even get second place in their own division. It felt like a disappointing end to what could have been a very exciting year. But nonetheless, considering the talent level and where they're at, they definitely played above their expectations. They got some extra wins. They showed they can be competitive. Now they just need to take that final step. So just like with the Seahawks, I'm giving the Cardinals a C+. And in last place in the division, I really can't believe I'm saying this, you've got the San Francisco 49ers. At this point, it was Super Bowl or bust. After what happened last year, after getting so close in an overtime game against the Chiefs, it felt natural that it was all about just getting back to the big game and finishing the job, but it just was not meant to be. In large fault because of so many injuries on both sides of the ball. I mean, you knew things were going to be a struggle when Christian McCaffrey was struggling and he just couldn't stay healthy. He's such an important part of the team, but that's the risk you take with him at the end of the day. There are other people with nagging injuries. You had contract dilemmas as well. Everything pretty much went wrong for this Niners team, and they ended up getting freaking last place in their division. Now, you got to give them some grace because of those injuries. Things could have been different if they were fully healthy, of course, but it felt like they should have been better than this anyway, in my opinion. It's really sad that they couldn't even make the playoffs, considering how often they have been in the Super Bowl or like the NFC Championship game recently. I feel like I have no choice but to give these guys a D. It is a massive disappointment to see them go from Super Bowl contenders to last in their division. Now let's take a walk over to the AFC, starting with the East and the Buffalo Bills. I feel conflicted with Buffalo, because obviously at this point in the Josh Allen era, it's all about just getting to the Super Bowl, and at the end of the day, they couldn't do it yet again. Once again, they find themselves coming up short against Kansas City. They just can't get past their nemesis, and that's really all that matters. All the other stuff, I mean, it's kind of just minor details. It's about how you perform in the playoffs, and they could not do it again. But I feel like a lot of credit needs to be given to this Buffalo team regardless. They can't get a perfect grade because they weren't able to get to the big game, but they were still able to win 13 games on this year, with a lot of questions on how good this team could be after all the changes they made in the offseason, with trading away Stephon Diggs, with lots of weapons coming and going, the defense looking a lot different. We didn't know if Buffalo could even win their own division, at least in my opinion. It felt like it could be a tight race. But not only did they win it, they absolutely cruised through it. I mean, without question, they were one of the best teams in the AFC. This might have been the best iteration of the Bills I have ever seen in the Josh Allen era. It seemed like they played so much more around him. There weren't so many self-centered individuals on the team. There was more camaraderie with this squad. They felt more confident, and this, in my opinion, was the closest they ever got to getting to the big game, to dethroning the Chiefs. This version of the Bills was very impressive to me, and I'm excited to see where things can go from here. It was a disappointing end, but this could only be the beginning, considering some of the recent players they drafted and their potential to develop into superstar players. I'm giving the Buffalo Bills an A-. Not perfect because they couldn't make the Super Bowl, but let's be honest, they overcame a lot of adversity and question marks this season, and they deserve the credit for it. The Miami Dolphins. Well, they're another team where it's all about the injuries, man. Tua had yet another severe head trauma thing happen. I feel really bad for the guy, but it really costed this team games. I mean, for a while, with him out, it felt like this was one of the most miserable teams, if not the worst team in the league, with Tyler Huntley under center. Absolutely no offense. They felt soulless. Tyreek Hill couldn't do anything this year. It was a really boring team to watch, and even when Tua did come back, they just couldn't get it together. They made use of the easy opponents on their schedule, but couldn't beat any of the relevant ones. It's the same old story with the Dolphins. When it matters in crunch time in December, they just can't get it done. But still, at least they made some kind of resurgence to make the season interesting, so I'll give them a C-. And then we gotta talk about everybody's favorite AFC East team, the New York Jets. Man, oh man, was I wrong about these guys, huh? I expected them to win their division and at least make the playoffs bare minimum, but what we got instead was an absolute train wreck. And there's no excuse this time. Aaron Rodgers played the entire season. He was healthy. He was just awful. They started the season 2-1, and then it went all downhill from there. The offense still looked as stagnant as ever, even with Aaron Rodgers out there, almost like at times Zach Wilson never even left. They couldn't make use of their superstars. Their defense ended up being overrated. The locker room was up in flames. They fired their coach mid-season and their general manager, and Aaron Rodgers just took advantage of the whole team, trying to bring his whole posse in there just for it to make no difference whatsoever. This was the most Jet season of all time, where they give you some kind of hope. The talent is obviously there, but they still can't do anything with it. They actually had expectations this year, and they ended up coming nowhere close to the bar. One of the worst seasons I have ever seen in Jets history when there was some kind of expectation placed on them. I'm giving them an F. And lastly, there's the New England Patriots. Pretty boring team to watch. I mean, this was the beginning of the rebuild. You brought in Drake May to try and be your franchise quarterback. The guy was trying his best not to die out there because of how horrible the O-line was. Clearly, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I don't want to blame them too much because it's only the first year of this whole rebuild, trying to figure out where to go in your post-dynasty era. But man, it was really sad to watch. They need help on the offensive line. They need some actual weapons. They need to hit with some trades or by drafting the right wide receivers. They just can't seem to do that for some reason. The defense needs a lot of help. I mean, they freaking fired Gerard Mayo after his one and only season being there. This was an all-out disaster, and they still have to do a lot of work if they want to regain their former glory. Hopefully with Vrabel there, that'll put them down the right direction, but damn, a lot of holes got exposed from this Patriots team. They sucked. End of discussion. Final grade is a D. How about the AFC North, though? The Baltimore Ravens, I'd say, had a pretty successful season overall. You brought in Derrick Henry to try and transform this offense, and he certainly made that happen. Him and Lamar Jackson were absolutely unstoppable. This might have been the most exciting I've ever seen Baltimore's offense be under Lamar Jackson. Just that 1-2 punch with the run game. Derrick Henry looked like he was in his prime again with how he was running over people, looking like a potential MVP early on in the season. And then there was Lamar, who a lot of people would argue should have been the MVP, putting up his best statistical season by a country mile in his career. Everything went pretty well. They won their division for the most part with relative ease. They beat some good teams along the way. The only problems were, one, their defense didn't look quite as sharp this year, and two, when it came to making an actual playoff push, once again, they were nothing but chokers. That's the one problem, man. It's the only thing that matters. It's just like with Buffalo, but almost even worse with these guys because of the criticism Lamar tends to face in the playoffs. This guy just can't get it done, and it always feels like a lot of the time it's his fault with the turnovers. That game against Buffalo was so winnable, but he just kept on screwing up. And until he can overcome that and actually play a well-rounded playoff game against top-tier competition, there's no reason to see the Ravens as a threat, and therefore, this year wasn't as successful as it should have been. I give them a lot of credit for how great they looked in their first year with Derrick Henry there, but come on, man. It's all about making it to the Super Bowl, and they failed, so I'm giving them a B+. Then there's their rivals, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I was expecting a bit of a fall off this year, I won't lie. Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, it did not call out to me, but once again, Mike Tomlin showed why he is one of the greatest coaches of all time, always seemingly getting the most out of his talent. People love to play for him, and he was able to win games with two different starting quarterbacks. Both Justin Fields and Russell Wilson had their moments, which was absolutely wonderful. This Steelers team made the playoffs yet again when all the doubts out there were against them. It was special to watch. But unfortunately, in the end, as we got towards December, this team started to limp to the finish line, and they became the boring Steelers that we've seen year after year. No offense, a defense that tries to carry them, but it's not enough, and then it looks like they don't try out there in the playoffs, man. It's the same exact thing over and over again with this Steelers team, and I don't know when the ride is ever going to end. But regardless, just knowing the production they got out of their quarterback room, I feel like I'm entitled to give them a slightly above average grade. I was expecting the downfall to happen this year for sure. They win double-digit games yet again, so let's go with a B- for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Next, I've got to bring up the Cincinnati Bengals, easily one of the biggest disappointments of the season. Man, this team couldn't make the playoffs, even with Joe Burrow being fully healthy. They came short of their goals because of a horrid start in such a terrible defense for a team that's supposed to be a contender. I mean, oh my god, how much more can Joe Burrow do? Bro was putting up like 30 points every single game, and they still found ways to lose anyway. This dude could have been the MVP arguably if his team was able to make the playoffs, but again, the defense just wasn't good enough. This Bengals team was not talented enough, so it didn't matter how many points they were scoring every game because the other team was just scoring more because their defense is absolute garbage. It was good to see Joe Burrow come back strong after the injuries. Him and Jamar Chase still look unstoppable. They got good production out of Chase Brown. There's room for things to get better because they are such a desirable destination and they're such a talented team on offense, but they have so much that needs to be done if they can't even make the playoffs in Joe Burrow's prime when he's playing every single game. Major disappointment. I have to give them a D. But hey, it could be a lot worse. They could be the Cleveland Browns, who are an absolute dumpster fire, a super embarrassment. I can't even begin to tell you with words how pathetic this year was for the Cleveland Browns. And a lot of it is, again, as usual, because of their own incompetent decision-making at the highest level. Continuing to believe in Deshaun Watson, despite him being nothing but terrible since he's gotten here. And it ended just how you'd expect, with him looking garbage out there again, the offense being unfun, and it got to the point where absolutely everybody wanted this guy to just be out of there, and people were cheering when this guy went down with a season-ending injury. That was about the most eventful thing to happen for Browns fans this year, and that's just such a pathetic thing to say out loud. Now you have Myles Garrett requesting a trade, the team having no real direction, Deshaun Watson still stealing money from you, despite him not even playing next year. It's a disaster if you're a Browns fan, and this might have been one of the worst seasons we have ever seen from them. I mean, maybe even the worst since they went 0-16 back in the day. It really was that bad. So naturally, the only grade these guys deserve is a big fat F. Next, we've got the AFC South and the Houston Texans. I felt myself wanting a lot more out of this squad this year. It wasn't a horrible season. I mean, they won their division for the second time in a row in the CJ Stroud era, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. They were able to win a playoff game again this year, but I felt like there should have been more with this team. There were some clear-cut holes that presented themselves with this team, specifically with the offensive line. It is terrible. CJ Stroud had no time to throw, so naturally, he had a bit of a sophomore slump. He made some bad decisions as well, but man, that O-line was doing him no favors whatsoever. And it helps as well that there were so many key injuries with the offense. Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins for a while, Tank Dell. There was just too much for this team to overcome with the hand that was given to them. So they weren't able to make any real progress, and to me it almost felt like they went backwards. The AFC South, for the most part, felt up for grabs this year when everybody knew it should have been theirs right from the beginning. That's not a great look. Upgrades need to be had. Not the most optimism in the world right now. I was hoping to see them be a dark horse to make the AFC Championship. They didn't make it happen. Not all their fault, but I wanted more. I'll give them a B-. Then you have the only other relevant team in the AFC South, that being the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, it didn't start off that bad for these guys. For a while, it seemed like they had an outside chance looking in of maybe being a playoff contender. They didn't even get eliminated until very late into December, which is a testament to how good this team has it when it comes to some of their talent. But unfortunately, there are a lot of rough spots with this team after the good start, and a lot of it has to do with Anthony Richardson, both with the health, but also with him just being a questionable player in general. There are a lot of boneheaded decisions with this guy. There's a lack of discipline with his play, where it seems like it's boom or bust with him a lot of the time. There's the fact that he quit on his team at one point, the fact that they had to pivot to Joe Flacco, and they benched their franchise quarterback. Makes you wonder if they even have something with this guy, that there could be a QB issue with the Colts still, even after it seemed like maybe they had something last year. This team collapsed epically. They lost to the Giants. I mean, I don't know what else to say, man. It felt like there could have been a lot more with this team if they had the right quarterback under center, so I'm going to give them a C-. The Jacksonville Jaguars, another team filled with disappointment this season. And it doesn't even just have to do with Trevor Lawrence getting injured, because this team sucked even when he was healthy. They got off to such a horrid start. They couldn't beat anybody. They were always right there in these really close games, but the execution, it was non-existent, and that's a problem. That is an issue if Trevor Lawrence can't get the job done. He's your franchise quarterback that you just paid, but the results are not there with him on the field or not. And after he did go down and everything beyond, this team felt lifeless and sad and like one of the worst teams in the league. Just a couple of years removed from them being a playoff team, and it's seeming like the future was so bright. This Jags team has so many issues that need to be overcome, and the need to make sure that Trevor Lawrence can even be the guy. I'm not even sure at this point. And if it weren't for Brian Thomas, there'd be no bright spots whatsoever to talk about with this Jags team. A lot more is expected of them. They couldn't meet the benchmark. They're getting an F. Speaking of terrible teams, we can't go too far without talking about the Tennessee Titans, huh? Let's just get out of the way. They're also getting an F for being absolutely horrible. Mayo Man, Mason Rudolph, I don't care who's at QB. This team was not fun to watch. They're about as bad as they were supposed to be, but in some ways it almost felt worse because of the memes with Will Levis and almost ruining everything by winning some games late into the season. Luckily, other teams were more incompetent. They were able to get the number 1 pick overall, but it's not a good look that once again they need to draft a quarterback. It's just been nonstop with this team. After Ryan Tannehill left, it's just been nothing but downhill. Insult to injury with Derrick Henry and his success with the Baltimore Ravens as well. Tennessee are up in flames, and even if they draft a quarterback, it may not even matter with how much of a disaster the rest of the team is, and this year is a testament to that. This team is nowhere close to being good anymore. Their window has shut, and they need to just admit that and rebuild. Tennessee are garbage, and I can't think of a more suitable grade than an F. That's enough about the misery, though. Let's get into some more of the good teams from this year in the AFC West. So, the Kansas City Chiefs. Not the best way to end the year, huh? Very disappointing. So close to greatness. So close to history, so close to a three-peat, but it just wasn't meant to be. In the final hour, the contract with the devil wore off, they became human again, and they got crushed out of the building. Not great considering that at this point, it's just Super Bowl or bust with Pat Mahomes and Andy Reid. Any other result is basically unacceptable. So they can't get a perfect grade, but just the fact that they made the Super Bowl for a third year in a row deserves a lot of credit. That's not something that a lot of teams have ever done in NFL history, so you've got to nod your head there. And I mean, the fact that they won 15 games and they always seem to come out victorious in those clutch situations, all of that has to mean something, right? The season definitely felt a lot more ugly than the record would advertise, but 15 wins and a Super Bowl appearance is something that you've got to acknowledge, man. It's a pretty crazy season regardless of all the controversy and other issues that went on, things that clearly need to be addressed. It was a great year, definitely. So I am very happy to give them an A, even if it didn't end with that three-peat. The LA Chargers. I didn't have super high expectations for these guys in the first year of the Jim Harbaugh era. I thought maybe they could be a fringe playoff team, maybe they'd just be mediocre at best, but this guy was able to transform their defense right from day one. They went from one of the worst defensive units in the league to one of the best, at least when it comes to points per game and yards given up. It was a very impressive season for this Chargers team. Obviously, we want to see more with Justin Herbert and the offense, but this was only the first year, one step at a time. They went from being a disaster the last couple of years to making it to the playoffs, being one of the more prominent teams in the AFC. This Chargers team was competitive, they were tough, and they're back on the right track. The only thing left to do now is to get through this whole playoff choking thing, because damn, that game against the Texans was a disaster. They had every reason to win that game. They were the favorites and they were god-awful. Justin Herbert played the worst game I've ever seen him play. The defense crapped the bed after a while. That's what the Chargers need to do next. That has been their issue for so long, the ability to find success in the playoffs. They've got to take that next step. Jim Harbaugh has the pedigree to make it happen, so let's see what they can do, one step at a time. You improved the defense. J.K. Dobbins was able to resurrect his career, so now it's time to do the other small things. Give Justin Herbert some more weapons and improve accordingly. Final grade, B. There's also the Denver Broncos, who made the playoffs out of the AFC West, though, and this is one of the biggest surprises of the year. Myself and a lot of other people expected the Broncos to be a league bottom feeder. I thought they win 4, maybe 5 games at most, but they completely surpassed their expectations. Bo Nix, who was seen as a bit of a reach at the time, ended up being in the absolute perfect place. Sean Payton knew what he was doing. They immediately were able to connect, and Bo Nix had one of the better seasons of all of the rookies in his class. He was smart with the football. He had some great games. There's some things that needed to be improved upon, but for his first year, considering the expectations, this is such a good start. The Broncos may finally have a franchise quarterback after what seems like ages, basically since Peyton Manning was the quarterback of this football team. Bo was able to help take these guys to the playoffs for the first time in 10 years. That is an impressive feat, and that alone gives them a big grade. And we're not even including the defense, one of the best units in the league, if not the best. You had Pat Surtain take home Defensive Player of the Year as well. So many things went right for this Broncos team when they really weren't supposed to be all that good. I feel entitled to give the Broncos an A- for their efforts. Considering that they made the playoffs with the expectations, I feel that it's only fair to give them a very high grade. Good stuff from these guys. Who we most certainly cannot give a good grade for is the Vegas Raiders. I thought maybe with the talent they had, they'd be a little underrated, they'd go under the radar, but if anything, they're even worse than many of us thought they would be. It was a trash year from these guys. The Gardner Minshew experiment was a complete and utter disaster. They looked better with Aiden O'Connell out there, and he's not even anything special. And because they won some meaningless games late in the year, they have all but taken themselves out of the race to potentially draft Cam Ward and or Shedeur Sanders. It would take an absolute miracle for that to happen now, and that was basically the whole point of this year. At one point, it looked like they were going to get the #1 pick, and that alone makes me think they should be getting an F grade on the year for throwing away the #1 pick like that. But I mean, there's just so much more to it, right? Key players got injured early on. They got rid of Devontae Adams. They already fired Antonio Pierce. We have questions about who their next quarterback is going to be. Honestly, the only real bright spot of this team this year was Brock Bowers, who looks like a certified stud and maybe already the best tight end in the league. Outside of that, the Raiders have absolutely nothing going for them, and it seems like that could continue to be the case for the foreseeable future, so they just got to get an F here, man. This was a terrible year. And with that said, that is going to wrap up my personal season grade for all 32 teams. Let me know what you think down in the comments below and what letter grade you would give to all of these teams. And if you enjoyed this video, it would mean a lot if you could give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more NFL content.